Ladies and gentlemen, we are back, and you may ask me why on the GoldenV Podcast we are talking about the sport of baseball in the middle of January, but I'll tell you what. We are here with Niall O'Donoghue from C's Plus Baseball, also the Vancouver Canadians in-game announcer, starting usually at 6:30 p.m. at night on the PA, and Gerry McDonald from Batter's Box. And what Niall and Gerry have been doing is they have been compiling a top 30 list of Toronto Blue Jays prospects. How it relates to a podcast about Vancouver sports, the GoldenV Podcast, is the fact that the Vancouver Canadians are one of the teams that we cover. And so this is going to be a roughly, I would say about 30-minute. We had it down to 23 minutes according to Gerry's agenda. This is going to be a show about Blue Jays prospects with the Vancouver Canadians focus with the 2025 season upcoming. Vancouver Canadians announcing that their first home game will be Tuesday, April 15th, and I believe it is against their friendly playoff rivals from the 2024 season, the Spokane Indians. And I told myself, Niall, before we started, that I was not going to call them the Spokane Chiefs, which is the WHL hockey team, and I was calling them the Spokane Chiefs last year on the podcast. And I actually did it 3 times today. So let's just flip this around and get started with Niall and Gerry. Now, why don't you go ahead, and Gerry's going to talk a little bit as well about that list, because there's 8 players who appeared in Vancouver and who made it onto the top 30 list again.
Yeah, I think maybe the one that maybe a lot of observers might have been a little bit surprised about was Grant Rogers, who got in the last half. I think that was the big reason why he was on that list. Because we do kind of, Gerry and myself, we do weight the rankings from other sources as well. But I really liked what I saw of Grant Rogers when he arrived on the scene. Of course, what a way he began his Northwest career with 8 shutout innings, getting pitcher of the week. And his playoff start as well. I mean, he certainly pitched well enough for the Canadians to win. But Canadians wound up losing 3 one-run games in a 4-game series against Spokane. So those Spokane Indians, not the Chiefs, winning the Northwest League Championship Series. But I really liked what I saw out of Grant Rogers. I think he's a very interesting story as well. He could be like a Pat Venditti, you could say. He has the ability to throw right-handed and left-handed. And he had a serious elbow injury. He could not throw right-handed, and
I read about that
for a little bit. So, but I don't know. I really like what I see of him. I mean, he's a big guy, 6'7", and I think there's going to be a lot more in the tank for Grant Rogers. I'm sure he'll be back in Vancouver start 2025. I'm really looking forward to seeing what he's got going for 2025.
If you can see that, and I don't have the JPEG, but that's the lineup cards that I saved as I worked the Canadians last year, fan services. And so this was Saturday, September the 7th, and I remember it was the final fireworks night of the year. Very nice evening at the Nat, quite hot actually. Saturday night at the Nat, post-game fireworks extravaganza, wrapping up against the Eugene Emeralds, one of the last games of the season. Grant Rogers on the hill starting that game. I don't have the numbers from that game in front of me and I can find them, but what I'm also going to do is, while you guys review this list a little bit more, I'm going to share the Batter's Box site so people can see it. And I dropped in the article actually right here in the chat, because I want to make highlight of the number and where Grant appears on your guys' list. And if you guys can dive into that a little bit more on Rogers and just what happened with the list and how you guys kind of ranked it.
Well, Niall and I did it. When you do it, it's subjective. You kind of look and say, how did a player perform? Where was he drafted? Did he live up to the expectations? Did he play really well?
Right.
And so sometimes you get players who were not highly regarded. Nobody really thought of them as a prospect, but had a really good season. And Grant Rogers, who Niall just talked about, was a guy like that who people didn't expect necessarily to be in the top 30 list, but he had a really good year, which put him in there. And then you have people who were drafted very close to the top of the draft who've got a good previous pedigree, like Jerron Watts-Brown, who didn't have a good year in Vancouver.
Yeah, right.
But still, because he was a pretty high draft choice of the Jays, gets kind of the benefit of the doubt to say maybe he'll figure it out. When we talked to Brent LaValle a few months ago, he kind of talked that Giron would have a problem with big innings. When guys got on base, he'd sometimes kind of have trouble getting out of it. And so sometimes guys just kind of can figure something out. Another guy who was kind of pretty high on the list was Jace Borfin, who we have at number 13 on the top 30. And if you saw him in the first half of the year in Vancouver, you think, oh, is this guy a top 30 guy? I'm not sure. But then he figured something out with his approach, with his stance, and he had a tremendous second half of the year. So you just kind of got to look at the entire picture and make kind of a subjective guess. And as Niall said, I put my top 30 down, and Niall puts his top 30 down, and we may look at what somebody else says, and we aggregate them all and kind of come up with an average, and that's the list that makes it onto the site.
Yeah, and it's a fantastic site, and it's a I seem to recall with Borfin too, and I have the number in my head. Writing my Wednesday weekly Batters Box update, there was something about an OPS slugging, or there was a certain stat that popped up in August in my August updates that indicated there was an 800 or 900 series OPS that he had, or that's what his number was, and it stood out to people. And I seem to recall that was one of the things about Borfin that really caught my attention. And I know, and perhaps because I read that and wrote that when I was at the games, working or just in the stands, I remember looking and watching for Jason, thinking, yeah, something's changed, but also wanting to watch him hit more. So I don't know how you guys feel about that, but one of the things
in August, I got the numbers here. In August, he hit 368, and he hit 6 doubles and 6 home runs in 23 games. So he just exploded in August.
There's something about Borfin that, and actually just looking back at the transcript, as I transcribed our Brent LaValle podcast, and I've also shared that in the chat, facebook.com/GoldenV Podcast, buzzsprout.com/1869778. Season 4, episode 9 is our episode where Gerry and I spoke with Brent LaValle, streaming live, and I posted that on battersbox.ca. And also one of the previous episodes back in late July that Niall and I did, season 3, episode 30, which would have been the end of July 2024. That came up with Borfin, and I just remember being struck by how he just sort of something clicked there, and it was just like, oh, okay. But one of the things we're going to review too is, I know we talked about it in the previous episode with Brent LaValle and myself, was a couple of players who stood out in the Arizona Fall League last year, being Adrian Pinto and Peyton Williams. And I wanted to spend a little bit of time discussing that. And what I was actually looking for was that article in the Arizona Fall League and Peyton's performance in the Arizona Fall League. Notwithstanding, I made Brent LaValle laugh because I called him the Iowa Meat Truck. And I don't think I will ever forget that nickname, the Iowa Meat Truck. And I want to see Peyton back again at the ballpark. I also remember seeing him eating 3-foot hot dogs before the gates opened. So that kind of makes me feel happy that somebody was eating that 3-foot hot dog. But yeah, no, Peyton Williams and Adrian Pinto, we discussed quite a bit with Brent, obviously because of their performance in the Arizona Fall League, and Adrian's performance towards the end of the regular season, where he was slotting in a lot at second base. And I have the starting lineups from the first 2 home games in the Northwest League Championship Series, where he really stood out. And then the home run for him, meaning Pinto, in Game 3, which shifted back to Spokane. And even though the Canadians lost that series, I always felt like the Canadians were close. Niall, what did you think? Because they were knocking on the door every game, and it was just one of those things where it seemed like the margin for error was really thin. And when you lose by 1 run, it's not like it's a blowout, right?
No, I mean, it was, I think the Canadians wound up scoring first in all their losses, and
They did.
Spokane scored first in game 2 and took the loss. No, it was just one of those series. I mean, you know, you mentioned I believe Victor Arias, and I just wonder if they were able to get Arias back in the lineup. He went down with a late season injury.
That's right.
Maybe he might have been a difference maker. Who knows? But you talked about Adrian Pinto. He was definitely a difference maker when he did play. As I pointed out in the batter's box write-up we did on him. I mean, 162 games is an MLB season. That was his regular season total at the end of his 4th season in the minor leagues. So, I mean, hopefully we're going to see him at least play 100 games, hopefully in 2025. Canadians are being very careful with him. I know he had, I believe, when he first arrived on the scene, I think he had, a 2-hit game and then a 3-hit game. And then he wasn't in the lineup the next day. It's just the Canadians are being very careful. He's had a lot of lower body, leg, hamstring issues, that sort of thing. So they were being very careful with him. And then he took like a week off in August, but they got him good and ready for the postseason. And who knows, had the Canadians maybe found a way to win it, he might have maybe gained some MVP consideration. That's how good he was. He was such a spark plug. Of course, the memory I'll always have of him in 2024 was a grand slam home run, turning a 3-run deficit into eventually a 1-run victory. And
I remember
such an exciting moment. I mean, you wouldn't think Adrian Pinto is going to be, I don't think you can expect grand slams out of him every night, but he's a guy, I guess it's been described, I think it was Baseball Prospectus says, he hits like he hates the baseball. I mean, he just...
Yeah, I remember that too, actually. I remember that too.
Well, that's what he, that's the kind of excitement he can provide. And second baseman or outfield, who knows where he's going to eventually wind up, but it looked like it was second base that maybe they'll eventually settle on. So very exciting player to watch out for. Maybe we'll see him again with Vancouver, or will they challenge him to New Hampshire? But, it's so hard to determine sometimes, where the Blue Jays will assign these guys. Of course, it depends on spring training. If they have an awesome spring training, maybe they'll be challenged by jumping up another level to, say, maybe New Hampshire or Buffalo. So who knows?
Yeah, and that kind of leads into our next part of our little outline here. Just looking at some notes we had here about discussing players who spent part of the season in Vancouver who should be back in 2025. We already reviewed that, but I had a couple of comments about Watts Brown too, because one of the things I remember about Watts Brown was, and we saw it in the playoffs, that game against Spokane, and I saw it through some games throughout the season. And just for whatever reason, for me, I happened to get a lot of Batters Bucks updates Wednesday night where I was following Watts Brown when he was in Dunedin, and then obviously games in Vancouver. And I don't remember exactly what Brent Lavalley said, but it was always a case where he'd struggle, and what he would do is give up a home run. Because you know that happened a lot to Watts Brown, and then he would settle down and he'd get a first inning start at Nat Bailey Stadium, and there'd be a long ball or a runner on base and a long ball, or a couple of big hits for the other team, and then he would sort of cruise through the next 5 innings after that, right? At like almost completely the opposite, being very strong on the mound, and pitch counts that were more strikes than balls, and the like. But let's look at who on your list, gentlemen, and I will share it again, is in the top 5 for Batters Box. And he, obviously, I remember Niall, myself, Chris George's Canadians broadcaster. Chris was on the show in September 2024. But Arjun Amala is the guy I think everybody wants to see. We'll see if and when how he pops up in Vancouver in 2025. But why don't you guys elaborate a little more on that top 5 and what's happening with Arjun Amala?
Well, he got 300 at bats in Dunedin in 2024,
right.
And the start of his time there was okay. Then he kind of got pretty hot, but he got pretty hot in a couple of areas. He's got an incredible amount of power. He's almost comparable to our Elvis Martinez when he was at the lower levels. But his batting for average, he also struck out a bit too much.
Right.
And so the uncertainty when you look at the Blue Jays for 2025 is, do they say, look, he's been able to kind of hit lots of home runs against Dunedin pitching, we're going to send him to Vancouver? Or do they say he needs to kind of control the strikeouts a little bit, so we're going to keep him in Dunedin for a while and hopefully send him to Vancouver after a month or two? That's up in the air, and as Niall said a minute ago, you don't really know. It can depend how he looks in spring training. So we don't really know. And an example of that is the number 2 prospect, which is Orelvis Martinez, who didn't have a good year because he had a drug suspension. But when he was in Vancouver back in 2021, he didn't play very well, really. And the Blue Jays the next year sent him up to New Hampshire, even though he hadn't really played that well in Vancouver, and he really struggled. And so the question of timing, when is a good time to send somebody up to the next level, is one that is a very tricky one for front offices to figure out, where you don't want to kill somebody's confidence and you want to give them the ability to go up. The number 3 is Trey Savage, who was drafted by the Blue Jays last year and hasn't pitched. And again, do the Blue Jays start him off in Dunedin, or do they start him off in Vancouver? But they would certainly hope he'd get to Vancouver by mid-season as the number 1 pick for the Blue Jays, 20th overall. And number 4 and number 5 are 2 guys who did play a little bit in Vancouver. Alan Roden, who was in Vancouver in 2023, and Ricky Tiedemann, who was there in 2022, but who's been injured a lot. He was the former number 1 and probably would be number 1 if he didn't get injured all the time. Mm-hmm. So, Niall, I don't know if you want to add anything on any of those 5 guys.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see where Namala is going to wind up. I suspect, Gerry, you might be right. I could see him probably starting the year back in Dunedin, just get maybe just a final touch of seasoning. But as far as Namala goes, who knows? But I'm definitely looking forward to seeing him when he does get here. But it wouldn't surprise me if maybe, probably just to avoid the cold weather a little bit. But I mean, eventually, the goal is to play in the American League East, and you are going to have those cold weather games like Baltimore, and so eventually
he's only 19.
Yeah.
He's only 19, so he's got lots of time. He was drafted as 17-year-old.
Yeah.
That's what I noticed too. Yeah. Go ahead, no.
Sorry, I was going to say
no problem.
Orelvis Martinez, Vancouver. Well, he had a Vancouver uniform, but he never played in Vancouver, unfortunately. We did not get a chance to see him because that was the year the Canadians were exiled to Hillsborough.
That's right.
Vancouver was Everett, Washington's. And unfortunately, I would love to have gone to see him in Everett. I do like to take the occasional trip to Everett, but of course, due to border issues at the time, that wasn't going to be possible. But I am looking forward to seeing what Orelvis Martinez is going to do, and hopefully he can kind of redeem himself and have a good 2025, and eventually we'll see him back in a Blue Jays uniform again.
Yeah, I had forgotten about the 80 game suspension, and I remember at the time he was up in Toronto, and then that happened. And that just seemed like another blow to the Blue Jays. And I recall, Niall, you and I talked a little bit about that podcast at the end of July last year, because the Jays had basically sold off a lot of the players they had acquired, including guys like Justin Turner, and they had sort of determined that they weren't going to compete that season, or things weren't working well based on the players they'd acquired, and some of the sort of like veterans they'd brought in, and they had high hopes for Orelvis, and then he gets an 80 game pet suspension, and I was just like, oh boy. So
it's a bit like a Greek tragedy, You get drafted very young out of Dominican Republic. You spend, kind of 6 years trying to get to the major leagues. You get to the major leagues, you play one game, and now you're suspended for 80 games.
Yeah, no, I mean, pet suspensions have happened to some high-profile players. I remember the Fernando Tatis Jr. one with the Padres a couple of years ago. I mean, that really hurt him, and that was one you're just like, well, what did he take? Or I mean, I don't know if you can find it, but I don't know what's on the PED list, and I've heard rumors about lists like that where it's common cold medicine or certain types of medication, and you would think that people would take no problem, and it's on the PED list, and it's like, oh, okay, and they just end up, it just ends up derailing somebody's time in baseball, even if it was something people would consider to be legitimate or over the counter. But let's keep moving here, guys, because 2024 draftees, Gerry, you had down here.
Yeah, there was a lot of drafted hitters who hit really well in Dunedin. And now they only got a little, 50, 60 at-bats, maybe 100 at-bats in Dunedin. But they're college guys. And so college guys you think should be able to handle Vancouver. And so we've got a third baseman, Sean Keys, who's a fourth-round draft pick.
Okay.
He hit the ground running in Dunedin. We've got Aaron Parker, a catcher, who played really well, and Eddie Micheletti Jr., an outfielder. So those three guys were guys who showed they could handle Dunedin in a small sample size, and you would think there's a pretty good chance that the three of those guys will be in Vancouver to start the season in April.
Yeah. And I was just looking at the way you guys did the list too, sharing the links, because you've got all the top 30, and then you've got something called the others. And so I'm looking through some familiar names there. Obviously, Addison Barger, we saw him in 2022 in Vancouver. Remember Nell telling me at the time he thought he was here too long. And obviously playing in the major leagues last year. Spencer Horwitz being another one. And just looking at guys who dropped off the list, I remember being impressed with Damiano Parmigiani in Vancouver, Chad Dallas. Who else? That's mainly it. But
Dallas could have been on the list, except he was one of the Jays' many, many pitchers who ended up having Tommy John surgery.
Right, that's what it was.
The Jays had a whole host of guys some high school guys who probably could have been in Vancouver next year, who will be rehabbing through a lot of 2025.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate. I mean, I'm just trying to think if there's other guys we can share information on that were on these lists or things that popped up for me. I remember one of the articles when I did the research for our chat with Brett LaValle was the fact that Jackson Hornung pops up. I don't know if he popped up on any of your lists when I scanned through it, and I don't know if Niall's got any more thoughts on Jackson, because I just remember Niall and I discussing Jackson last year in July, and the main thing I noticed with Jackson was him moving around to different positions. They had three catchers at the time. That was one of the trades that happened. That's right. When the Jays moved Yimi Garcia, right, and they moved him to Seattle, and we ended up with Jacob Sharp, a catcher. They released Yomer Hernandez, and then Jackson was moving around. He was DHing. He was at first base. He was playing catcher. So maybe now you can add any more thoughts on a guy like Jackson. I don't know if he popped up on any of your lists, but there's definitely some interest and some intrigue there, at least from my perspective, and just watching Jackson on the field. So I don't know what he's up to.
Yeah, I think he was kind of, if memory serves correctly, I think he and Jace Borfin wound up playing the most games for Vancouver this year. So certainly a constant presence in the lineup. As you mentioned, Jacob Sharp came in, and it seemed like he kind of got the lion's share of the catching.
He did.
They had Brooks as a catcher for a while, and Jomer Hernandez, as you mentioned. And I was kind of saddened and shocked to see Jomer get let go, because I thought he certainly had the chops to work behind the plate. I know sometimes he did have some mental lapses, and I think that was kind of maybe some drawbacks, but he would always make up with it with, great hustle, great play. And, I really enjoyed watching him catch. Robert Brooks was somebody else. He wasn't here in Vancouver for a long time, but was a pretty good time. I really liked what he brought to the roster. But then Jacob Sharp more or less kind of had the majority of the innings behind the plate, and was certainly leaned on heavily as Canadians were making their playoff run. And I think Jacob Sharp, we might see him again. I thought he acquitted himself pretty well, considering, when he arrived in the Blue Jays system, he was still at low A Modesto. So he got not only traded, but also a bump in level. So the Blue Jays obviously saw something in Jacob Sharp, and I think they were proven right. And I wouldn't be surprised if we do see Jacob Sharp back here to start the year, and then maybe move on to New Hampshire later in the summer. But getting back to Jackson Hornung, I think he did moonlight a few times in the outfield as well. And
he did.
Pretty good athlete. and it was also a Northwest League postseason All-Star as well at catcher. So he had a pretty good year, and wasn't really sure what to expect from Jackson. I know he didn't have the greatest of starts when he got his brief cameo with Dunedin in 2023, but I thought he acquitted himself pretty well. I'm pretty sure we'll see him at AA New Hampshire to start 2025.
Okay.
Yeah. One thing about Jackson, is that he hit pretty well for a catcher, but if he's going to be a first baseman or an outfielder, he would have to hit better. So that was my question, and you guys could answer the question. Do you think he will be a catcher, or is he going to lose those catcher at-bats to Sharp and Brooks?
That's going to be one for the Blue Jays brass to decide, and I think maybe they might have kind of answered that already by giving Sharp, basically when he arrived on the scene, a lot of time behind the plate. So, I think there's still value there in Jackson Hornung. Of course, we all know the Blue Jays. I think every team really does, but especially the Blue Jays really seem to appreciate positional versatility. So, we'll see how it breaks out. But yeah, there's going to be a lot of healthy competition for who's going to be catching with AA New Hampshire in 2025.
Was there any? If we're gonna, and we should probably wrap it up there. Any last minute thoughts? Stuff you guys want to throw out? Anything else we should look at in terms of the list? Any other?
I think we didn't mention that Kendry Rojas is the top ranked Vancouver player. We talked about him a little bit with Brent, so I won't go into a lot of detail on him, but just to kind of give him the props for being number one Vancouver guy. And the list this year has got a lot of potential in it. The Jays system isn't highly regarded because it doesn't have necessarily a lot of top talent other than the top couple of guys. But there's a lot of guys who could be useful major leaguers, but maybe not stars. So it's worth kind of looking at the list and just noticing the depth of talent.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I was trying to think of who else popped up in my head on the list. And you guys had listed it, looking at my old lineup cards. I think the one guy we didn't mention that you guys talked about was Cutter Coffee. I have him starting one of the playoff games against Spokane at third base. And I'm trying to think of who else. And the one other guy we didn't mention before we wrap it up too was Javon Ward, because Ward came up and I thought made some noise for Vancouver, especially in the home games I saw, in terms of how he was playing.
Yeah, I thought Cutter Coffee, unfortunately, he had such a good stretch in May where I believe he hit 8 home runs in 6 games or 7 games, whatever it was, one player of the week, and he kind of started struggling again, and unfortunately the struggles kind of continued in the early going. Seemed to show a bit of signs of life towards the end of the year. I think he also had an injury to deal with, because I think he did miss a few days of action, but he was a second-round pick of the Boston Red Sox, so we'll see what an off-season can do for him. I mean, he'll get a chance to check out things of the player development complex and see how that can help his game. But I think really he was kind of one of the main pieces of that trade in the Danny Jansen deal. But I think, but he had a pretty decent game too, if I recall correctly, in the Northwest League Championship Series. The only game the Canadians won, I believe he scored the winning run or tied. Anyway, he had a pretty good game. I think that was his kind of his breakout moment with the Canadians in 2024. As for Javon Ward, I think he really added some length to the lineup, and that was a nice pickup. He was in the Brewers farm system for quite a while, and then they got him out of indie ball, and he's a big guy, very long legs. It seems like when he starts motoring around the bases, he chews up an awful lot of ground. I think that one memory I'll have of Javon Ward is when he made some nice catches, but there was one where he basically tumbled over the short right field wall into the empty barbecue area, and somehow managed to hang on. I mean, getting and there's the tarp as well, and it was amazing he wasn't seriously injured. But to give up the body to make a nice catch like that, I mean, but yeah, Javon Ward was definitely I think we'll see him, I'm sure, in AA in 2025, because I think that might have been really his best pro season. So who knows? Might be a classic late bloomer for sure.
I'll just say age. Oh,
Yeah,
age,
age too, yeah. So
Yeah,
age makes a big difference in prospects. Cutter Coffee is only 20, and so when you get traded at 20, sometimes it can be a shock to the system. So you kind of tend to discount those last couple of months. And Javon is 25, and 25 is old for Vancouver. So there you got the really young and the really old, the old for the age level combined.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Thank you again for this.
Yeah, I guess that's pretty much it. But yeah, I thought Javon Ward, what a year he had. Maybe I just wanted to shout out to Irv Carter as well. I know he didn't make our top 30, but I really like watching him pitch. He a bit from the Marcus Stroman school. Likes to stick around. But off the field, wonderful young man, and I'm sure we'll see him back with Vancouver. But I just wanted to give him a little shout out before.
You guys can, no problem. Now feel free to shout out anybody you want to before we wrap it up, because it's important to do that. And Gerry, any last sort of comments or thoughts?
No, nothing else. But Irv Carter, I saw, was up in Toronto over the off season visiting kids in the hospital. So that's a pretty good thing to do from a guy from the South to come up to Toronto with Desan Brown to go visit kids.
Nice.
Yeah, and the one thing I was going to add is the last couple of weeks, Desan had his little workshops in Vancouver for kids wanting to play baseball. And I remember Niall and I talked about it, and he left last year. But Devon was truly one of the loved and treasured players at the Nat, and just who he was. And I never actually met Desan, but it just from what I heard, and seeing the fact that he still comes back to Vancouver in the off season in the winter to do those workshops shows how much love there is in Vancouver for Desan. And I think in recent memory for me, he's certainly one of the most loved recent Canadians players in the last couple of years. So anyways, guys, thank you for this. A couple of things before we wrap it up here. Battersbox.ca. Check that out, guys. And I've already shared it here in the chat. Great site on baseball in general, the Toronto Blue Jays, and just the amount of time and effort that goes into that, and the comments on the message boards. And the fact is, Gerry also told me once that it's not one of those sites where there's a lot of trash talking or, sort of social media slagging. And that's why I like it so much too, is a lot of baseball enthusiasts and purists on that site who really are focusing on learning and teaching about the game of baseball, which I love. But thank you both for doing this. Make sure you check out C's Plus Baseball as well. Hopefully see you soon, Niall. And Gerry, thanks again for doing this. We'll talk to everyone soon.
Take care.